You are listening to Coast AM. Hello there, Connie Willis with you. Please join me and my shows at conniewillis.com. Connie After Dark is one where you can have a drink with me. It's a virtual live bar, and we have a really good time. And what happens there stays there, never to be seen again. Also, Blue Rock Talk that takes you to live investigations of creepy hotspots. And also, we do a lot of talking and a lot of figuring out, what's going on out there. Just having fun, at least talking about it for sure. And then also, you're going to find a book that Lynn Buchanan helped me. Well, he gave me the method. Okay. So Lynn Buchanan, one of my close friends, and of course, a friend here at Coast to Coast AM. And he's one of the psychic spies, right? In the true Project Stargate. But at one point when I was taking his classes, I'm certified under him of remote viewing. Of course, you always want to know the lottery numbers, right? You're like, well, can you teach us how to do that? So he had a method that he put together, and it was using one of the tools that the psychic spies would use to find hostages, weapons, whatever that they were looking for, that they were tasked to look for. And we were all trying to pick numbers from it and try to win the lottery at that point. This was, golly, back in before 2012. I know that because the book came out on Amazon then. And I had asked him, I said, is it okay? Can I do anything with this? Put it together, a course or class or book or something. He goes, yeah. So I did. And it's called Win Any Lottery. And you can go to Amazon to pick that up, or you can go to my website and learn a little bit more about it. I'm putting together a course, but it's using a pendulum and your intuition and using a method that the remote viewers, the psychic spies used, and it's to find winning numbers so that you can win the jackpot. Now, I've gotten a lot of feedback. I actually put it out in 2012, took it off for a little bit, put it back in. So if you're good with your intuition and if you're good with a pendulum, you're going to absolutely love it. Win Any Lottery is what it's called. But it's, you use a pendulum. So those of you that say, I'm good with that, or those of you that say, I'm good with my intuition, then you'll be good with a pendulum. But you can pick winning numbers. And as soon as you do it, you're going to go, oh, I get it. You're going to totally get it. It takes time, but you're going to get it. And you're going to see that it's worthy of your time. You're going to go, I know that I can do this. And it's really fun. And a lot of you have written already and saying that you are winning money. So you've already got your money back on it. But, let's keep going. Let's keep going. So if you want to learn more, go to ConnieWillis.com. All right. Charles Ostman is with us tonight, and he is talking about DNA, altering that, making us super soldiers. Now, there's a lot of super soldiers, Charles. We can go back to, and just some differentiation. We were talking about this over the weekend on one of my shows, is super soldiers. At one point, they were apparently, I think it was the Russians, I think it was building a human that was absolutely amazing. And they said that the Dogman was a super soldier. And then they said the Bigfoot was a super soldier that was created by the Russians. And then there was also the super soldiers that were the younger boys at the time. And there were some girls apparently in it that came out later and said they were, where when they would go to sleep at night, they were abducted, they were taken to other planets, and they were fighting, or they were training for some futuristic wars and fights that were going to be happening here on our planet or just on other planets. And then they would wake up in the morning as if it was time to go to school or whatever they were going to do. And they would be all beat up. They'd wake up going, oh, I guess it was a dream. But then they'd have all these bruises and things. So, but we're talking a whole different super soldier where it's us as humans just being, manipulated into the best of the best of the best. Of course, I wanted to know more about the emotions, the passion and love, if that all can be incorporated, and making the perfect people. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? But it just keeps going into another branch, another thought, and another thought. It's just totally complex. Yep. I mean, how do you see all this going?
Well, okay, so going back to the emotion/passion index, which is actually a very interesting thing to look at. Since we're talking about other planets and so on, I'm going to take a bit of a risk. But like I said, this is coast to coast, so what the heck?
That's right.
I present to like an academic body, but whatever. So if one was to take a look at previous visitation by ET, going back maybe 50,000 years or more, going back to the days of the Anunnaki and that whole thing. For those folks that are familiar, I'm sure this will sound like usual stuff. Okay, so if the Anunnaki were let's just say the introduction of alien DNA to our DNA, and hybrids were produced and this sort of thing. So there's a theory that says, and you've probably heard this before, that us humanoids in our current format were actually the result of some hybrid tinkering. That these ETs came down here. They wanted to grab up some available hominids, modify them to suit their purposes, make them intelligent enough so they could perform tasks and be sort of malleable as people to do their bidding, but not too much because otherwise they might get out of hand or revolt and that kind of thing. So one of the factors that was altered to suit that purpose was to magnify their proclivity for irrational worship. And, I use that word kind of carefully because I don't want to degrade anyone's beliefs or faith, or that's not what I'm going for. I'm not trying to cast a bad light on anyone's faith. But what I'm suggesting is that there was a proclivity, especially among some groups, to just almost blindly accept whatever the passion of the moment happens to be brought to them by some kind of a prophet or religious figure. Well, okay, what would be the mechanism for that? Well, interestingly enough, UC San Diego, UCSD, and also some other locations, people were brought in for fMRI scans in real time so they could see what part of the brain lights up when they were introduced to spiritual content. In other words, they specifically looked for people who tended to be heavily religious. They would get them involved with a meditation or prayer or some other aspect of their religious belief and see if there was a measurable difference in how certain parts of their brain reacted, compared to others. And sure enough, in more than half of the people who were tested this way, there was a very specific part of the brain that lit up. There's something called the God part of the brain that is sort of related to that idea. Okay, fine. Well, what made that possible? Why would this be produced in the first place? In other words, nature is pretty efficient in designing what it does. Things that don't work out that well or don't serve much of a purpose eventually get sort of mutated out of the genome, out of the gene pool, as it were. But this has stayed. This has remained. It's very specific in how permanent this indoctrination aspect is, and it's there for a reason, or so I would propose to you. If that's the case, then this is the genetic residue, you might say, of that earlier hybrid tinkering brought to us by ETs that wanted to, on purpose, create a hominid species variant that would do their bidding, but also revere them as gods or as things to be worshipped, and therefore be much more socially malleable to suit their purposes.
We are the robots creating new robots.
Well, to go full circle, some people have argued, and I understand this argument, that we're violating the rules of nature. That we've, not just with this, but also with AI, et cetera, that we're stepping way outside the box of what should be allowed, if you will. If we want to take the pathway of this is God's creation, and here we are violating all of God's prescriptions for what we're supposed to be, who we're supposed to be. Well, I would argue that a little bit. The reason why is this: we are inventing tools. We have free will. Like in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, in the very opening scene, you see the sort of ape-like hominids hanging around this water pool, and they're fighting with the water. And one of the ape critters grabs a big bone and starts bashing in the head of his neighbor so they could take advantage of the water. And he's bashing away and bashing away and bashing away, and he throws the bone up in the air and suddenly morphs into the Pan Am spaceship, in orbit around Earth. In other words, they were trying to correlate. Stanley Kubrick was trying to make this bridge between the first use of tools, a bone to bash in the neighbor's head, versus the current tools of the future, as it were, advanced spacecraft. Okay, fine. So here we are. We've been inventing very clever and very interesting technology, not just to mimic various forms of intelligence, but to actually use AI in this context to create physical artifacts, that is, physical components that would actually change our DNA, possibly for some future form of what I might call artificial evolution. Well, are we violating nature, or is this just part of nature? In other words, we have evolved to the point where we can actually make these tools. Now, how we choose to use the tools could be argued, and that could be a huge argument in and of itself. But I don't see this as violating anything. I see this as the natural order of things. And I would further suggest that on other worlds, the organism there, whether it be hominids or something else, probably went through something very similar. They spent many thousands of years kind of ambling along as hunter-gatherers and then eventually crossed into the pathway of organized societies, larger and larger cityscapes, organized manufacturing and farming, that kind of thing. And then they have this burst, this kind of industrial revolution type of growth, at the very tail end of their evolutionary process in that realm. And then suddenly they would get to this next layer of evolution, where they have all these different technologies all at once, which is exactly what we're seeing now. We've really, if you look at the past 100 years, the technical development is exponentially much more than all of the millennia before it, that we know of at least. So it's almost like this vertical line spiking up towards what you might call the singularity. I would suggest that other civilizations have gone through something like this, very similar. Many probably didn't make it. They probably failed because they succumbed to the unfortunate sort of darker or dystopian usages of their newly invented tools. But some civilizations, however they did this, eventually had the spiritual wisdom collectively to not be subject to the darker, more selfish usage of these tools, but rather to enhance the quality of life and the quality of their world, as it were. We're kind of at that crossroads as we speak. So I see this genetic enhancement tool system as being a piece of that, like a large puzzle. And I see this as being like a piece of that puzzle as that picture becomes more visible to the average viewer.
Well, I know you like taking phone calls, so we're going to do that. We got some callers that want to talk to you a little bit, and I want to make sure you also, I also want to make sure you get everything out that you say, because this is interesting stuff for sure. Wildcard line number 2. Let's talk to Mayat out of New York City. Hello, is it Mayat? Is that your name?
Yes, M-A apostrophe A-T. It's the Kemetic Egyptian goddess of justice, right, good, and balance. Connie,
I love it.
Is so brilliant. That's going to be on my list for the holiday season reading. And at the very least, if you understand the power of the pendulum, that even if the universe is not ready for you to have a ton of money, you will learn so many things and become more sensitive, psychic, and intuitive. So thank you for that. But
You're right. You're welcome.
My 2-part question to Charles is, boy, so far we've survived the atomic and the hydrogen technologies and bombs, but I think we got a Sisyphean situation before us with the fact that they call it artificial and then intelligence. That tells you a lot right there, but I want to know if you've had a chance to look at what nations have come up. I think Europe is more far advanced, at least in terms of the privacy issue. But what do you see with the blueprint of the world and of nations as to the ethical framework, or how to keep it on some ethical framework? And the second part would be, I don't know if you're familiar, but of course communities that are already over and super surveilled and super and over policed are finding out that this facial recognition, I can't recall his name right now, but a black man spent a week in jail. It should have been obvious he wasn't even in the area of the alleged crime because of wrong programming by white males of this facial recognition. And if you have my question, and I love your bumper music, Connie, I'll listen. I have to stream on a Saturday night, so just give me a second. Slow down your answer so I can turn the computer, flowing with the program. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much. Did you get that?
Yeah. So the first part of the question is kind of interesting. The idea would be to have like an international ethics committee of sorts, like a United Nations of Science. And interestingly enough, I actually worked with a group called the Millennium Project, and that was exactly what they were trying to do, headed by Jerome. What's his last name? I should remember this. Oh, no, I can't remember his name.
How dare you?
Yeah, I know. I'm so sorry. This was a number of years ago. But the outcome or the process, as I saw it to be, was that even though idealistically it was a wonderful idea, and we actually, this was a Singularity University over in Palo Alto, and we had a whole series of meetings, and people from all over the world would come, and we'd have these conferences and so on. And it was really nice, and I thought, wow, this is kind of cool. However, what became apparent was there was really no enforcement mechanism. In other words, it was one thing to have kind of like an echo chamber where everybody was on the same page, and it's a very eclectic group of folks, maybe 100 people or so. We're all systematically very much in the same, sync, as it were, synchronized together. But was there any way, even remotely, to hope that this could be sort of outsourced to other nation states around the world, and they would see the same idea and sort of adopt this concept? And in my estimation, it just seemed unrealistic. Now, other folks, may disagree or agree, but it just seems like it's a wonderful idea. But to be really honest with you, I don't know what the possibilities are of actually affecting enough of the human condition, as it were. This is the problem I often have with these sort of things. People can try to project what should be the ethical template that most people would abide by or feel is right, but the reality of how to get people to agree to this, even when it will cost them maybe some level of economic access or some other cost factor that they have to be willing to surrender or sacrifice in order to have the better, greater good as a result. I don't know. It's really hard to pinpoint that. But as a way to make that kind of a policy possible, you'd have to have an awful lot of convergence around the idea of being willing to exchange personal or sort of what you might call nationalistic greed or power, et cetera, and transfer that more into sort of a generalized planetary scale ethical standard. I just don't know if that's within the range of human behavior in its current form. I wish I had an answer, but I really don't. But I did actually spend some time with this Millennium Project, and I saw attempts at this. And this goes back, 12, 13, 14 years ago. And people are still trying this kind of thing. But however it goes in the future, I don't honestly know. The second question I'm trying to remember was, I'm so sorry, she had another question. Facial recognition. Okay. So.
And we got about a minute. So you'll know.
Facial recognition stuff it's a work in progress. Now, I'm really sorry that this African-American gentleman ended up in jail for something he didn't do or because the facial recognition stuff didn't work as well. But this is kind of a weird answer. The better this equipment becomes, the safer it becomes. And let me see if I can sort of justify this. If you look at DNA, you go backwards in time, and especially for people of color, especially for African-American people, many of whom were convicted of horrible crimes that did not commit, murders and rapes and all kinds of awful things. And decades later, it became that through DNA evidence, they weren't there. They didn't commit the crime at all. The whole thing was some horrible racist, nonsense. And only now we're starting to unravel some of this.
And it's a good thing we're doing that for everyone. Historianofthefuturex.com. That's where you can find Charles Ostman. Stay with us. Connie Willis on Coast to Coast AM. Coast to Coast AM, Connie Willis here, having a good evening with you and learning a lot tonight. I mean, just, doing my best to process this. Really, that's the way it is. Some conversations you can get really deep into, at least I can with you. And then we get the mad scientist in, and it's, you hear what he's saying. Charles Ostman is with us tonight. You hear what he's saying, and then you're like, wait a minute. I gotta process that big time. I gotta get that visual before the next visual you just gave and the next visual, because it's amazing stuff. And it just is, holy cow, Charles, seriously. So we got some phone calls to take. But I also, because this is the last segment with you, I want to make sure you get to at least put the points out there that you'd like to, throw out to people before we go to the phone calls and before the show does end. So, okay. And then I also want to ask, as a citizen, can a citizen change our DNA through normal means? Or, is it always going to be the choice of somebody else's at first, but can we also change it later?
Well, funny you should point that out, because that's kind of where I was going to go with this. But okay, so my 2 cents or 2 femtocents worth, I don't know how small that is, but my sort of input to this process would be as follows. I suggest that evolution tends to favor the most adaptive, not really the fittest, but the most adaptive. And I say that because define fitness. What may seem fit for some at a particular moment in time may be completely meaningless in some other scenario and certainly in some other time frame. So it's the ability to adapt, to rapidly morph into something else as needed, like genetic shape-shifting, if you want to call it that. And I think that's exactly what humans are supposed to do. That's what we're designed for. And that's kind of why we have been able to get as far as we have to engineer these kinds of tool systems, because the theory is that as the world gets ever more complex and apparent time keeps shrinking downward, which it is, and information processing keeps going up, which it is, and complexity keeps going up, we have to in some way adapt to this ever-changing scenario that is so radically different than what life was like even, say, a century ago, that I don't see any other way other than to adapt through some kind of genetic morphology, at least in some context. So is this supposed to happen? Is this part of the event stream of the future? I would say so. I would say this is actually, like I said earlier, this is part of nature as it's supposed to be, and that we are, in fact, being sort of instructed or guided to some kind of evolution of the most adaptive way possible. The other thing I might toss out is that genetic engineering is not, how would I say this, from the military perspective. I spent a fair amount of time in biodefense-related things, and I won't go into too much. I was involved with sensors and detecting biopathogens, that kind of thing. And the thing that really got people's attention, and I agree with this, is that for some rogue group, nation state or even just a private group, that wanted to, for any variety of reasons, create some horrible hantavirus that mute times 10 or something, Andromeda strain on steroids, whatever. This is actually possible. This is what scares me the most. Unlike developing a nuclear bomb, let's say, that requires an enormous facility, extremely expensive equipment, a lot of highly specialized technical people, it's a big thing to do. You're not going to do it sort of in the back of a building somewhere. However, genetic modification of existing organisms, that can be done like in a house, a couple of rooms in a house. The CRISPR materials that are required and the actual platform itself where you do the genetic editing, you can fit this into a bedroom, with a desk and a couple of computers. I mean, it's amazing how fast this has grown. And in fact, you can actually buy, if you wish, your own personal, CRISPR tool system, if you wish, for a few tens of thousands of dollars. You too can now make your own designer bacteria, or whatever. I mean, that's a whole sort of separate world. But what I'm getting at is, because this is becoming ever more accessible, can rogue players that do not have any sort of ethical confinement, as we might have, decide to start playing around with this stuff just for the sake of doing so? And I would say, yeah, probably so. So do we need to have tools that can neutralize and detect and counteract with whatever awful stuff might get invented, either on purpose or by accident? And I would say, yes, absolutely. So we need to sort of track along with this genetic engineering capacity for our own safety as well as for our own adaptation. And I just, in other words, rather than seeing this entirely as a dystopian nightmare to be avoided at all costs, I would say rather adapt to it, understand what it is, and adapt accordingly.
Yeah. There's an incredible bright side to all of that, but then there's always that scary side. But I always like to look at the positive, and yeah, I think people will go the other route, of course, and play around with it. And that's the shame part of all these really great things, too, that have come about, like AI and some of the other stuff. Let's go to the phone calls here. By the way, you can find Charles at historianofthefuturex.com. Let's go. First-time caller, Chris out of Michigan. Hey there, Chris. You are on the air. Welcome to Coast AM.
Thanks for taking my call, Connie. Charles, a quick question for you. I want to get your thoughts on the current use of pharmacogenomic testing through places like Mayo Clinic's One-Ohm Lab, and if you think that in the near future patients will be able to obtain designer medications through the use of genomics, things like CRISPR technology, mRNA, and AI to help combat their unique
I totally understand. So I think this is actually absolutely on the horizon. Now, this is two separate worlds to look at. One is it possible? Is there efficacy enough to actually justify developing this further? I would say yes, of course. However, in the world of regulatory confinements, as I'm sure you can imagine, it takes a long time for any kind of medical anything to find its way through the different layers of approval before it finally is allowed for human testing, this kind of thing. Now, that's been changing a little bit, especially more recently, and I don't remember the actual name of the bill that was passed, but there has been some effort to allow critical patients, people who are on their deathbed, as it were, who are facing a number of months of living at best, to try experimental medications, even though the risks may be high. If it's only the last few months of life in this world, why not let them try it, see what happens? So that's been loosening up a little bit. The other thing is that elsewhere in the world, I actually testified to the FDA. Oh gosh, this was back in 2005, 2006. I went to Bethesda, Maryland, addressed a room full of people, about 50 people there. These were all senior department heads and different managers of the different departments. And I spent about 90 minutes presenting all these different aspects of what was then nanomolecular or sort of nanomechanical medical solutions or potential solutions for different kinds of diseases, cancer and other things. At the end of which, I said, the reality is this, that whatever comes out of the virtual, various labs and different academic research sites, that's one thing. But it's something entirely different to determine what people are going to have access through your regulatory mechanism. But before you decide on this, the role is no longer controlled by U.S.-determined protocols. They didn't like to hear this very much. In other words, they were thinking in terms of traditional. I'm sorry. Let me back up. Usually in FDA compliance standards, you have two very distinct pathways: either chemistry, that being drugs, or machinery, physical devices. The nano world is sort of in between. You're talking about quasi-mechanical, sort of molecular scale things, which may or may not be organic in nature, but they interact with organic things. It's sort of a complicated middle gray zone. And they didn't have any regulatory standards for that yet. And that's kind of why I was there, along with some other people that were presenting similar ideas. So I said, look, no matter what it is, if people start to find out that they can access some kind of preemptive genomic solution for whatever difficulty they're facing, they're going to go there, whether it's Taiwan or Mexico or somewhere in Southeast Asia or just anywhere. They're going to have tourism. You're going to have nanomedical tourism out there. And the same would apply to this sort of thing. So I think the whole regulatory compliancy standards, as was the case going back a few decades, which takes incredibly long time, very expensive and very sort of elaborate, will that bit changed a little bit or relaxed or at least modified to suit this genre of development? I think so. I think there's enough interest in doing so that there's certainly a motivation for going that direction. I hope that answers the question. That's the best answer I can offer.
Well, let's see if we can go ahead and grab another call here real quick, because time flies, doesn't it? When you're on the show, it flies. Yeah, exactly. I know. Wildcard line number 4. Let's talk to Ed out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Hey there, Ed. Welcome. You're on the air.
Thank you, Connie. Listen, I have one question, and you touched on it a little bit, possibly about 50,000 years ago, but one of the shocking things to me was when I found out our mitochondria has an entirely different DNA than the rest of our body. And that made me right away wonder if someone had used that as a way to change us, like you're talking about. And I'm interested in your opinion on that. And I had one other thing, but that's okay. I'd like to answer on that one on DNA.
Sure. Well, I'm kind of an outlier in the sense that even though I have a lot of academic friends and people in the sciences world that would probably never talk about this in public, in private, over dinner or a cup of coffee or something, they might be a lot more open to, we're not going to say yes or no, but it's interesting. So there's two separate worlds. There's the world of officially sanctioned, vetted information versus people's opinions. And I'm sort of the opinion that I think it's certainly possible. I wouldn't want to rule it out by any means. I think there's certainly enough credible potential evidence that this could have happened in some context.
So I'm going to ask you a quickie.
Sure.
As well. Okay, so earlier, and maybe I have this all wrong, but follow me on this for a little bit. So earlier you mentioned something, and you mentioned junk DNA.
Right.
Was that right? Okay.
Yes.
So if that's an empty, is that possibly something empty where maybe we can just put a program in ourselves?
Well, yes and no. This is a really controversial area, and let me see if I can fill out some details here. So when the gene was first decoded, it was like 95% junk. That is, we could say exactly which protein pairs, which protein subunits were located where. We could draw a map and say, and of all these millions of protein pairs, here they are. However, could we describe what they do? No. I mean, it was very iffy at the time. However, this is where supercomputing and this kind of thing comes in, because with computing power, you can run through incredibly complex, huge amounts of data, look for patterns, look for different commonalities that would begin to expose where the physiological tie-in between known protein pairs and known physiological attributes start to occur. And believe me, this is really, that's why I'm saying quantum computing will probably change this radically. So the answer for this is there's less junk DNA now than there was because we have a better handle on determining what some of this is there for. There's also replicants. There's lots of chunks of DNA that are replicated multiple times. It's almost like redundant systems, as it were. In other words, if a certain section, a critical section of DNA is damaged, what happens? Could there be another chunk of that same DNA lurking about that could be sort of fetched up and utilized in its place? And it seems that's the case, at least in some areas. Now, again, this is still very uncharted territory, but the ratio of junk versus non-junk, I'm sorry for better choice of words, and just the whole idea of trying to assess functionality, I'm going to just submit the opinion, just my opinion, that there is no junk at all, that everything has a purpose.
Agreed.
We simply haven't unraveled what those purposes are yet.
Agreed, 100,000%. It's like there's no junk. We just don't know what it is yet. So exactly. That's what we say. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? I know you know this one. There's what we know. There's what we don't know. Then there's what we don't know that we don't know. That's the bigger percentage of all of it.
I think Dick Cheney was the one that.
I like that. Is that who it was? Is that who it was?
Yeah, we know what we don't know, or we don't know what we should know, or something like that.
Yeah, and that's the biggest percentage of all, what we don't know that we don't know. So, Charles, it was great having you here. And how does everybody find you or get a hold of you if they'd like to?
Yeah, just go to the website. I should be there. I exist. This is true. I'm not a bot. I mean, I really do exist. And, I'll try to answer as many as I can. I get a lot of emails when I go to the area like this, but that's my whole purpose. I like to see what people are thinking about, what their thoughts might be. Because at some point, this is going to make its way into the public forum. And, given what political strategies are like right now with the climate and the political sort of ecosystem, it's pretty crazy. So I'd like people to become more informed, at least have some mechanism by which they can say, okay, this might make sense or not make sense, but at least have something to work with as a start point. All
right. historianofthefuturex.com. Thank you so much, Charles. We'll talk to you soon. I appreciate that. Good stuff. All right. Stick around with us. You want to talk about aliens and UFOs and creepy creatures and different things that are actually happening on the Bradshaw Ranch? Well, stick around. We've got that for you coming up next here on Coast to Coast AM with Connie Willis.